Welcome to this meeting of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Over the past week, President Trump's tour of the Gulf has put a spotlight on some of the region's most influential Islamic countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. And ongoing nuclear negotiations are also keeping Iran in the news cycle. But while the world often sees the Middle East as the center of the Islamic world, home to the holy sites of Mecca and Medina, and to over 400 million Muslims, the Middle East actually only accounts for around 20% of the world's Muslim population. The majority, around 60% or around 1.1 billion Muslims, reside across the rest of Asia, with the region hosting the world's largest domestic Muslim populations in Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Complex religious and geopolitical tensions have developed between major Middle Eastern and Asian states to control the definition of Islam in the 21st century, the result of which will have a huge influence on who is able to wield religious soft power, secure leadership of the Islamic world, and project strategic and moral influence worldwide, as well as shaping how hundreds of millions of people will live their lives and understand and practice their faith. To explain this battle for the soul of Islam, we're lucky to have with us today James M Dorsey. James is an award-winning journalist, acclaimed scholar, and adjunct senior fellow at Singapore's S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He has reported from all corners of the Islamic world and lived in multiple Muslim and non-Muslim countries as a foreign correspondent for major media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and the New York Times. James is also the author of The Battle for the Soul of Islam, Defining the Muslim Faith in the 21st Century, on which today's lecture is based. So, as usual, we'll have time following James's talk for questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them later on. But otherwise, I'd like to hand over to James.
Charles, thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm grateful to the Royal Society for hosting me. Let me start by taking you back in time, in fact, a century ago to 1924. At the time, Jordanian ruler King Abdullah I, the current King Abdullah's great-grandfather, was convinced that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the visionary who carved modern Turkey out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, had handed him leadership of the Muslim world on a silver platter, with the abolishment of the caliphate by the newly appointed Turkish parliament. After almost 500 years of Ottoman leadership, colonial rule, if you will, abolishing the caliphate created a vacuum. Abdullah, whose family claims descendants from the Prophet Muhammad, and at times governed the holy city of Mecca, was euphoric. He couldn't believe his luck. He was inclined to send Ataturk a congratulatory telegram. He told the Manchester Guardian that the caliphate is an Arab institution. The Prophet was an Arab. The Quran is in Arabic. The holy places are in Arabia, and the caliph should be an Arab of the tribe of Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet. The caliphate had returned to Arabia in Abdullah's mind. The fact of the matter is that it didn't. A century later, it is not the caliphate that Middle Eastern and Asian Muslim powerhouses are fighting about, despite efforts by religious militants and jihadists like the Islamic State to establish a credible caliphate. Today, Middle Eastern and Asian Muslim powerhouses compete for religious soft power, the ability to define what Islam stands for in the 21st century, and geopolitical influence. A core element of that competition is whether Islamic law needs to be reformed to eliminate problematic and outdated concepts, including whether the concept of a caliphate should be maintained in Muslim religious law. The significance of this battle lies in what is at stake. The battle will determine which Muslim majority country or countries will be recognized as religious and or spiritual trendsetters of the Islamic world, and the degree to which moderate Islam incorporates the notion of a nation state, as opposed to the caliphate, as well as principles of tolerance, pluralism, gender equality, and human rights, as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The major competitors fall into two broad categories. proponents of a state-controlled form of Islam, whose principles are defined by the political needs of an authoritarian or autocratic state, and advocates of an interpretation of the faith that is defined by civil society, embraces principles of humanitarianism, pluralism, human rights, and involves legal recontextualization and or reform of Islam to address problematic and discriminatory notions. It is a battle for the soul of Islam. The battle pits rival Middle Eastern and Asian powers against one another. The primary players are Saudi Arabia, home to Islam's holiest sites. The United Arab Emirates, like Saudi Arabia, promulgators of a militantly authoritarian interpretation of Islam, and Indonesia, which promotes an independent, humanitarian, and pluralistic notion of Islam that reaches out to other faiths, as well as non-Muslim center-right forces across the globe. The two Gulf states and Indonesia are widely viewed as proponents of an interpretation of Islam that is moderate, at least in social terms, as opposed to Turkey and Iran, who represent socially more conservative and politically more militant expressions of the faith. Other players, like Qatar and Morocco, have either dropped out of the race or focus on regional rather than global influence. In the ultimate analysis, no clear winner may emerge from this battle. Yet the course of the complex religious and geopolitical rivalry could determine the degree to which Islam will be defined by one or more competing stripes of ultra-conservatism or statist forms of the faith that preach absolute obedience to the ruler and reduce religious establishments to pawns of the state. These players seek to perpetuate what historian Ahmed Kuru calls the alliance between Muslim religious scholars, the ulama, and the state, as opposed to a truly more tolerant and a pluralistic interpretation of one of the three Abrahamic religions. Moreover, the outcome of this battle is likely to play a significant role in determining the prospect for peace and security, not only in the vast region extending from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Philippines, but also in Europe and the United States. Implicit in the rivalry is a broader debate across the Muslim world that goes to the heart of the relation between the state and religion. What role the state, if at all, should play in the enforcement of religious morals, and the place of religion in education, judicial systems, and politics. Increasingly, the lines dividing the state and religion become more blurred, the more autocratic a political system is. The history of the quest for Muslim religious soft and geopolitical power tells the story of an increasingly competitive struggle with the staggered entry of new players. Initially, the Saudis, with Egyptian, Pakistani, and a degree of West African input, had the playing field in the 1960s and 1970s more or less to themselves, as they created the building blocks of what became the world's single most focused, state-run, well-funded public diplomacy campaign. Ultimately, Saudi Arabia invested far more in this campaign than the Soviet Union or the United States allocated to their public diplomacy during the Cold War. The campaign sought to impose the kingdom's ultra-conservative, austere, and Puritan strand of the faith, known as Wahhabism, on Muslim communities across the globe. The Saudi effort, in contrast to the soft power efforts of the United States, which could rely on its private sector cultural attributes, was by necessity a top-down, largely government-financed initiative that garnered support among Muslims worldwide. The bulk of Saudi monies went to nonviolent, ultra-conservative religious, cultural, and media institutions in countries stretching from China across Eurasia and Africa into the Americas. In recent years, the level of Saudi funding has significantly dropped, and the primary focus of the kingdom's religious soft power diplomacy has changed with the rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The original vehicles, like the Muslim World League, have been turned into propagators of bin Salman's problematic image of Saudi Arabia as a cutting-edge, progressive, forward-looking, and tolerant society, rather than the harsh, inaccessible, and secretive kingdom it once was. Bin Salman's campaign seeks to portray decades of Saudi support for an intolerant and supremacist Muslim worldview as an aberration of history. The drive conveniently overlooks Saudi Arabia's abysmal human rights record and the limits to non-Muslim practices that it continues to impose. The campaign is designed to open doors, attract foreign investment, and position Saudi Arabia as a major player on the international stage through demonstrative acts that create an image that does not necessarily reflect reality. To be clear, this is not to deny that there has been significant change in Saudi Arabia, with enhanced rights for women and cultural liberalization. Saudi Arabia's most performative act was the February 2020 visit to the Nazi concentration camp, Auschwitz, in Poland, by a delegation of 25 prominent Muslim clergymen led by Mohammed Alisa, the head of the Muslim World League, and the group's forging of alliances with Jewish, evangelical, Buddhist, and Hindu communities. To cement the kingdom's new image, Al-Issa travels the world to promote Saudi Arabia's vaguely defined concept of religious moderation and tolerance, engages in ceremonial interfaith dialogue, and issues declarative statements. Even so, the kingdom's significant retreat from religiously packaged foreign funding of Sunni Muslim ultra-conservatism has created opportunity for its religious soft power competitors. The retreat also forced the kingdom to attempt to co-opt those seeking to advance a more pluralistic and truly tolerant Islam that involves jurisprudential reform and an unrestricted endorsement of the, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because they pose a challenge to what amounts to the kingdom's self-serving endeavor. Foremost among these more progressive forces is Indonesia's Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest and most moderate Muslim civil society movement, which has engaged with its authoritarian rivals, including the Muslim World League and various groups sponsored by the United Arab Emirates, but has not accommodated their autocratic inclinations, despite at times accepting financial contributions. Even so, facts on the ground in the kingdom and beyond call into question the extent of Saudi moderation and the degree to which it is structurally cemented. Reform in the kingdom involves carefully managed, genuine social change, but does not amount to a wholesale repudiation of long-standing Islamic jurisprudence that embraces obsolete, outdated, and supremacist concepts. Significant reforms, such as subjugation of the kingdom's ultra-conservative religious establishment, greater rights and opportunities for women, and the creation of an entertainment industry, were driven by Crown Prince Mohammed's perceived political requirements, as well as the economic and social building blocks needed for diversification of the Saudi economy. They were at best anchored in rulings of hardly independent courts, issued in line with government policy, rather than in a sweeping reinterpretation of religious law that would redefine Islamic jurisprudence as such. One largely overlooked area where Saudi Arabia and the UAE have made real progress is textbooks. After decades of torturous, minuscule steps to rewrite the kingdom's onerous textbooks, Impact SE, an Israeli textbook watchdog, has praised Saudi Arabia for dumping textbooks that contained inflammatory examples related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the promotion of jihad, defined as an offensive, violent act and martyrdom. Impact SE said new textbooks largely removed negative portrayals of Jews and Christians and much of the homophobic content in older texts. Instead, they promoted concepts of moderation, openness, and peaceful development through a step-by-step process, as well as tolerance. The deletions include references to Jews as treacherous individuals and Quranic verses that allegedly describe Jews as apes monkeys, and pigs. The new textbooks draw the line of tolerance at nonviolent political Islam, militant and jihadist Islamists, and atheism, described as a dangerous phenomenon that can lead to moral corruption, crime, and the destruction of the family. The new textbooks walk a fine line in dealing with Israel and the Palestinians at a time when the Gaza wars enraged Saudi, Middle Eastern, and Muslim public opinion, with no ability for Saudis to show solidarity with the Palestinians or vent anger against Israel and its supporters. Even so, the textbooks appear designed to prepare the next generation of Saudis for the possibility of normalization of relations with Israel. The textbooks seek to strike a balance by not identifying Israel by name and removing the term Palestine from maps that in older texts was used to refer to pre-1967 Israel, as well as the West Bank and Gaza conquered by Israel during the 1967 war. At the same time, the books no longer identify Israel as an enemy state or Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. Instead, the textbooks refer to occupied East Jerusalem, suggesting that the western part of the city could be Israeli and the eastern part Palestinian in a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict involving the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Similarly, the textbooks have dropped references to Zionism as a racist European movement and portrayals of the conflict as a religious dispute in which Israel seeks to destroy Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site, and take over Muslim holy places. Prince Mohammed's embrace of religious tolerance and interfaith dialogue has produced frequent public interactions with Jewish and Christian leaders, but not led to a lifting of the ban on public non-Muslim worship and the building of non-Muslim houses of worship in the kingdom itself. Similarly, the kingdom, despite its designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, has continued to work with the group in, for example, Southeast Asia. The battle for the soul of Islam accelerated with the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The battle grew significantly more complex in the wake of 9/11, with the additional focus on the fight against transnational jihadists. More recently, the emphasis has shifted to competing efforts by multiple Middle Eastern and Asian Muslim majority states that, in their bid to garner religious soft power, either support or oppose not only violent, but also non-violent expressions of political Islam, such as the Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and Tablighi Jamaat. Each of the primary actors in this struggle seeks to impose their definition of how the faith should govern the religious and political life of believers across the globe. This struggle is occurring against the backdrop of a world in which the embrace of religious belief and the rise of nationalism and populism reflect the widespread disintegration of norms, values, and traditional worldviews that historically served to anchor individuals and provide meaning to their lives. Policymakers often concentrate on distinct policies and measures enacted by various major players. Most recently, these include Saudi Arabia's lifting of bans that restricted women's social and economic mobility, the United Arab Emirates' emphasis on tolerance and individual social rights, as well as its establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel, the focus on interfaith dialogue by some of the contenders for religious soft power, and containment of perceived threats from non-violent expressions of political Islam, first and foremost, among which the Brotherhood. The Islamic Revolution in Iran marked the moment that Saudi funding no longer was in a class of its own. The revolution heralded a new phase in Saudi-Iranian rivalry that has engulfed the Middle East, North Africa, and the non-Arab Muslim world, as well as the international community. Competition for religious soft power is a fixture of the rivalry that is alive and kicking despite the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Riyadh and Tehran. So is the difference in Saudi and Iranian concepts of religious soft power, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. Both approaches have sectarian traits. Saudi Arabia's thrust, driven by geopolitics, was with few exceptions designed to garner religious influence. Iran, on the other hand, focused on hard power in various Arab countries in which it supported religious militants. In Africa and Asia, however, Iran struck a different note by targeting religious communities and emphasizing spiritual and social issues. Having said this, the full fallout of Iran's recent setbacks with the Gaza war, the weakening of Hezbollah, and the fall of Syrian President Bashar al Assad has yet to manifest itself. The Iranian approach was shaped by a shift in Iran as a result of the Iran-Iraq war, from revolutionary religious zeal to Iranian nationalism. This was evident in emotive debates in parliament about the utility of the occupation of the US embassy in Tehran at a time that Iran was at war with Iraq. Men like Hojatollah Islam Hashemi Rafsanjani, the Speaker of Parliament who later became president, Ayatollah Mohammad Beheshti, the number two in the Iranian political hierarchy at the time, and Chief Jurist Ayatollah Sadegh Khalkhali, who was known as the hanging judge for his penchant for the death penalty, argued unsuccessfully in favor of a quick resolution of the embassy crisis so that Iran could focus on the defense of its territory and revolution. The debates signaled a shift from what was initially an ideological rivalry to a geopolitical fight that continues today with a religious soft and hard power strategy driven by the perception that the United States and the Gulf states were seeking to topple the Islamic regime. If the first phase of the battle for the soul of Islam was the initially largely uncontested Saudi religious soft power effort, and the second phase involved the emergence of an Iranian revolutionary competitor, the third and most recent phase is the most complex one, not only with the arrival of new players, but also because it involves rivalries within rivalries. The third phase is complicated by the fact that Iran's coupling of political and religious soft and hard power, that often involves recruitment of mercenaries and proxies, has, with the exception of Indonesia's approach, become the norm. That was evident with the Saudi UAE military intervention in Libya, Emirati, Egyptian, and Turkish support for opposing sides in Libya's civil war, and Gulf state and Turkish involvement in Syria. It also is evident in the current fighting in Sudan. Finally, the third phase lays bare the fact that employing notions of a moderate and tolerant Islam to garner religious soft power frequently is at best narrowly tailored to cater to the needs of public diplomacy as well as the requirements of economic reform. Various of the rivals failed to fully implement at home principles of political, social, and religious tolerance, pluralism, gender equality, and human rights, as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They also refrain from embedding these principles in a drive for recontextualization of Islamic jurisprudence as a building block for peace and security. This enables an autocratic form of Islam that is socially liberal but politically supports the principle of absolute obedience to the ruler. The rise of political Islam, particularly as a result of the 2011 popular Arab revolts that toppled leaders in Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen, fueled the worst fears of men like Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed. The revolts persuaded the UAE, a country that prides itself on being a cutting-edge home to people from some 190 countries, to adopt a two-pronged strategy. While projecting itself as an open and tolerant society at the forefront of Islamic moderation and tolerance, respect for religious diversity, and interfaith dialogue, the UAE, together with Saudi Arabia, lobbied in Western capitals for crackdowns on expressions of non-violent political Islam, such as the Muslim Brotherhood. In doing so, they risked encouraging Islamophobia in the Muslim world. Sorry, encouraging Islamophobia. In the Muslim world, the UAE, like Turkey and Iran, employed checkbook diplomacy and investments alongside arm twisting and military power to counter Islamists and shape religious and political environments. Speaking in 2005 to US Ambassador James Jeffrey, bin Zayed made no bones about his disdain for Salafism and Saudi ultra-conservatism. He compared Saudi Arabia's religious leaders to somebody like the one we are chasing in the mountains, a reference to Osama bin Laden, who was believed at the time to be hiding in a mountainous region of Pakistan. In an email to New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman 12 years later, Yusuf al-Otaiba, a confidant of bin Zayed and the UAE's ambassador in Washington, asserted that Abu Dhabi fought 200 years of wars with Saudi over Wahhabism. Multiple leaks have documented UAE efforts to sully the reputations of European Muslims, the Emiratis accused of being Islamists. Emirati obsession with Islamism drove the 3.5-year-long UAE Saudi-led boycott of Qatar, imposed in 2017 and lifted in 2021. Private Emirati scorn for Saudi Wahhabism translated in 2016 into a UAE effort to undermine Saudi religious diplomacy by sponsoring a gathering of prominent Sunni Muslim leaders in the Chechen capital of Grozny that effectively excommunicated the kingdom's interpretation of the faith. Western officials refrained from publicly commenting, but privately commended the attempt to confront a worldview that they feared provided breeding ground for social tensions and extremism. Bin Zayed played a key role in shaping bin Salman's policies to shave off Wahhabism's rougher edges, rather than wholesale reform the kingdom's religious worldview and bring the UAE and Saudi Arabia's religious soft power endeavors closer together. His approach centered on what author Shadi Hamid calls non-political politicized Islam, or a third trend in political Islam, that in the words of scholar Gregory Gauss, is tightly tied to state authority and subservient to it. Bin Zayed's efforts have paid off. Despite ruling at home with an iron fist, bin Zayed has been able to promote a state-controlled Islam that styles itself as tolerant and apolitical and preaches absolute obedience without legally addressing outdated or intolerant concepts embedded in the faith. These include notions of kafirs or infidels, slavery, Muslim supremacy, and the concept of a caliphate that remain reference points, even if large numbers of Muslims do not heed them. Bin Zayed's success, backed by armies of paid Western lobbyists, is evidenced by the fact that, in contrast to bin Salman and Saudi Arabia's reputational problems as a result of the 2018 killing in Istanbul of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the arrests and alleged torture of dissidents, as well as anyone deemed a potential threat, the UAE is widely perceived as a religiously tolerant, pluralistic, and enlightened society. The UAE has also successfully projected itself as a secular state, even though its constitution requires legislation to be compatible with Islamic law. In doing so, UAE leaders walk a fine line. The UAE scored one of its most significant successes with the first ever papal visit to the Emirates by Pope Francis, during which he signed a document on human fraternity with Ahmed al-Tayyib, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, an ancient citadel of Islamic learning. The Pope acknowledged the UAE's growing influence when, in a public address, he thanked his late advisor, Egyptian judge Mohammed Abdul Salam, who was also close to Egypt's al-Sisi, for drafting the declaration. Abdul Salam ensured that the UAE and the Egyptian president, rather than Al-Azhar, put their stamp on the document. Indonesia, the new kid on the block in the competition for Muslim religious soft power and leadership, has proven to be a different kettle of fish. Nahdlatul Ulama, rather than the governments of President Joko Widodo, and Prabowo Subianto, has emerged as a formidable religious soft power rival, capable of operating on the same level as states with which it competes. The Indonesian state initially took a backseat in the global competition. It benefited from its incestuous ties to Nahdlatul Ulama, as well as the movement's ability to gain access to corridors of power in world capitals, including Washington, London, Berlin, Budapest, Brussels, the Vatican, and Delhi. Nahdlatul Ulama was instrumental in organizing a visit to Indonesia, originally planned in 2020 by Pope Francis, that had to be postponed because of the coronavirus pandemic. Nahdlatul Ulama, rather than the government, invited and arranged a trip to Jakarta by US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who made a speech to a Nahdlatul Ulama event, the centerpiece of his visit. That changed briefly with the 2022 Indonesian chairmanship of the Group of 20. Indonesia made its mark with a summit of religious leaders that preceded the meeting of heads of state and government. The summit unsuccessfully attempted to refashion the G20's erstwhile interfaith track as the Religion 20. The R20 intended to bring together religious leaders to position religion as a source of solutions rather than problems. It was a call that resonated coming from the world's most populous Muslim majority country and democracy. The summit laid down a gauntlet for advocates of an autocratic form of moderate Islam by stressing the need to deal with historical grievances, truth-telling, reconciliation, and forgiveness, even if it was co-sponsored by the Muslim World League, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed's vehicle to garner religious soft power and help polish the kingdom's image. The League saw the invitation to co-host as legitimization by one of the world's most important Muslim civil society movements, as well as an opportunity to co-opt it, an effort that has so far failed. In contrast to its Saudi and Emirati rivals, Nahdlatul Ulama has gone beyond paying lip service to notions of tolerance and pluralism, with the issuance of jurisprudence intended to recontextualize the faith by eliminating problematic categories like infidels, the first of several such expected moves. In February 2023, the movement called for the replacement in Islamic law of the concept of the caliphate, a unitary state for the global Muslim community, with the notion of a nation state. The underlying argument was that only a change in religious law would deprive militants and jihadists of the ability to justify their ideology and actions. Nahdlatul Ulama's evolution towards a process of recontextualization dates to a 1992 gathering of religious scholars, chaired by Abdurrahman Wahid, the group's leader at the time and later president of Indonesia. The gathering noted that the changing context of reality necessitates the creation of new interpretations of Islamic law and orthodox Islamic teaching. Nahdlatul Ulama's ability to compete is evident in the increasingly influential role that it plays in the Centrist Democratic International, or CDI, the world's largest alliance of political parties that grew out of an alliance of European and Latin American Christian Democrats and today groups ruling parties across the globe. CDI's Economic Executive Committee includes top German officials, controversial Central European government leaders, including Viktor Orban of Hungary, as well as some of Europe and Latin America's most prominent politicians and former leaders. Nahdlatul Ulama's sway was evident in a resolution that was adopted at a meeting of the CDI Executive Committee in January 2020 in Yogyakarta. That was wholly Nahdlatul Ulama's thinking and language. The resolution called for the rule of law, adherence to universal ethics and humanitarian values based on Western humanism, Christian democracy, and Nahdlatul Ulama's concept of humanitarian Islam. The resolution urged CDI to push for a world based on those principles to counter the emergence of authoritarian, civilizationist states that do not accept the rules-based post-World War II order, whether in terms of human rights, rule of law, democracy, or respect for international borders and the sovereignty of other nations. Neither Saudi Arabia nor the UAE anticipated Nahdlatul Ulama's determination to push its concept of humanitarian Islam globally, including at the highest levels of government in Western capitals, as well as in countries like India. The degree to which Nahdlatul Ulama is perceived as a threat by the UAE and Saudi Arabia is evident in battles in high-level interfaith meetings convened by the Vatican, the State Department, and competition with Saudi Arabia and the UAE in influencing the religious tack of G20 summits since the 2022 gathering in Bali. Nahdlatul Ulama's rise to prominence was also what persuaded Muhammad Al Isa, the head of the Muslim World League, to visit the Indonesian group's headquarters in Jakarta in early 2020. It was the first visit to one of the world's foremost Islamic organizations in the league's almost 60-year history. Membership in the CDI of the National Awakening Party, or PKB, the political party of Nahdlatul Ulama, gives it a leg up on the UAE and Saudi Arabia that banned political parties. Moreover, Nahdlatul Ulama benefits from what journalist Muhammad Abu Fadl has described as a rejection of an Arab face of Islam, that, in his words, is hopelessly contorted by extremism. In Western perceptions, Abu Fadl suggested that certain elements in the West have become interested in Asian Islam, which appears to be more moderate than Arab Islam, less inclined to export radical ideology, less dominated by extremist interpretations of religion, and possessed of a genuine and sincere tendency to act with tolerance. In sum, the battle for the soul of Islam is being fought at multiple levels and across numerous platforms, ranging from the world's corridors of power to mosques and villages in the Indonesian countryside, to efforts to win hearts and minds in countries with young populations whose attitudes towards religion and religiosity are changing. Ultimately, these changing youth attitudes may be one factor determining the outcome of the battle for the soul of Islam. Thank you. I look forward to a healthy question and answer session.
That's great. Thank you very much, James. That was a really interesting lecture, which covered quite a lot of ground as well. For everyone who's listening, please put any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll get around to them as we go along. But just to start with, what do you think the impact of this competition is on the non-Islamic world? And on the outside, if you like. What do you think these vying interests mean to the rest of the world?
Well, I think it's problematic. And what I mean by that is, obviously 9/11 was a watershed. And certainly the Western world, but also significant parts of the rest of the world, have been looking for moderate Islam. And they've bought into, first and foremost, the Saudi and the UAE version of moderate Islam, which depends on how you want to define moderate. But in my mind, that's primarily an interpretation of moderate as being socially more flexible, politically more repressive, and propagating an autocratic form of governance. And it may not be surprising that governments, Western governments and other governments, have been willing to buy into that, because that's effectively what they had bought into all along prior to 9/11. In other words, they opted for what they perceived to be stability rather than for political and social change.
Interesting. So Do you think it plays into the sort of the rise that we're seeing across Northern Europe and the Middle East and Asia and Europe of populist politics and that sort of more you mentioned at the start the sort of conservative religious nationalism that's coming out of places like Turkey. Do you think that's all sort of part of a trend for certain contestants in this competition, or do you think this is a
Well,
separate phenomenon?
I think there are various issues here. Um, I mean, Turkey has a very sort of unique history, and while I would have no problem describing Recep Tayyip Erdogan as a populist, um, I also think that the Islamism in Turkey grows out of a very different history, going back to Ataturk. What I do think is that clearly there's a trend towards the right in Europe and the States. Migration is a major issue. For years, Islamophobia was a major issue. And the problem with that was that the effort, particularly by the United Arab Emirates, to securitize and weaponize the issue of Islam in Europe because of their perceptions of political Islam and their perceptions of uh, the inroads that political Islam may have made in Europe, that has contributed to. I don't think it was at the source of it, but it certainly contributed and strengthened the Islamophobic element of nationalist and populist movements.
Mm. Yeah, and like you say, that's a recurring theme across these different contexts. So we've got a question from the audience that asks, "What impact do you think Saudi control of two of the main holy sites has? What sort of influence does that have on this whole debate?"
It's major. It gives them a degree of moral, spiritual authority that no other state has. And as much as a group like Nahdlatul Ulama is at opposite ends with Saudi Arabia, it is somewhat cautious because of that enormous spiritual, cultural, religious power that comes from governing Islam's two holiest cities. Uh, you know, Muslims, one of the five principles is that if they can afford to do so, is to do the Hajj. The Hajj is to Saudi Arabia, leaving aside now financial muscle and so on. Um, that's very important, and it gives them an enormous advantage.
Mm.
An
Yeah,
advantage that played out when they were propagating a more conservative, more austere form of Islam, and an advantage that they have propagating their interpretation of what moderate Islam represents.
yeah. So another question from the audience here, which says, leaving Shia Islam and Iran to one side, would it be fair to describe the struggle for the soul of Islam as the Muslim Brotherhood versus the rest?
Okay, let me. I phrased the the term the battle for the soul of Islam fairly narrowly. So I've focused, and that's what I did in my book primarily, even though I do talk at length about Turkey and Qatar and Iran. But I focused it primarily on the rivalry to define moderate Islam. The Brotherhood, the Turks, the Iranians are not looking to define moderate Islam. They're looking to define Islam. And so I think, you know, what I as I sort of mentioned in my introduction, you have rivalries and you have rivalries within rivalries. So if you were to portray this as a struggle of people who are trying to define Islam as such, rather than a moderate interpretation, then what I was describing between, what's playing between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Indonesia would be a rivalry within a rivalry. If the main rivalry is with Turkey and Iran, um, I don't know. I think both of those rivalries, if you wish, are parallel and in a sense equally important.
Hmm. And there's another question from the audience here, which I'm sort of going to tie to another point. Do you think the question from the audience is what your thoughts are on Al-Aqsa's position in Jerusalem, given the current conflict and the control that is levied there by different groups? And I wonder what you think, going back to your point about Islamophobia, are there points like Al-Aqsa, like Islamophobia, that sort of unite these different factions and groups and sort of take the edge off the competition a bit? Or are these,
Well,
or is that sort of a separate thing to the competition still going on anyway?
the answer, let me answer the second part of the question first. And the answer to that is yes and no. And what I mean by that is that uh, it unites them on one level, because obviously the Muslim world believes that East Jerusalem, including the Haram al-Sharif or the Temple Mount, whatever you wanted to call it, um, should be under Palestinian uh, governance. But they then compete in who stands up the most for those Palestinian rights. So if you think back to when Trump in his first term recognized the annexation of Jerusalem by the Israel of East Jerusalem by the Israelis, and the positioning of Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel, the Turks were the ones that were throwing themselves up as the defenders of Jerusalem. And they did that on a back of competition between particularly the UAE, but also Saudi Arabia and the Turks in Jerusalem itself, with all kinds of activities, with real estate purchases and so on. So yes, but each of them tries to exploit it to the best to their advantage. In terms of the positioning of Al-Aqsa, Al-Aqsa is the third holiest site in Islam, as simple as that. And the Israelis, whether they're going to honor that going forward or not, and they've already started to break agreements that were made, but did agree that the Haram al-Sharif would be under uh, Jordanian Muslim religious custodianship, and that the rights of Jews on the Temple Mount would be regulated, if not restricted. Now, clearly, with ultra nationalists like Itamar Ben Gvir in the Israeli government, they're pushing the envelope. Uh, I think one of the key issues here, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it's a very emotive issue. And so what you've seen in the past, go back to the Intifadas when Ariel Sharon went to the Mount, and the Intifada that provoked. You've seen that subsequently, that skirmishes, interventions in Al-Aqsa have led to significant fallout. So in that sense, yes, it plays. I mean, the focus is on Gaza at the moment, obviously, for all the obvious reasons. But Al-Aqsa is a factor that one shouldn't underestimate.
Mm. You mentioned relations with the Vatican a few times, and I wonder, the Vatican, most of its policy is based on its religious doctrine by and large. Um, Do you think in this soft power competition, religious doctrine is shaping that competition, or do you think it's a geopolitical contest in a religious context?
I think it's both. Okay, let's put it this way. I don't think the Vatican is competing with moderate Islam.
No, no, of course not.
You know, so in that sense, I don't. With the Vatican, it's neither having good relations with the Vatican, currying favor with the Vatican is important to all the Muslim religious soft power rivals. Um, so, in a sense, let me put it this way: the importance of those relationships with the Vatican are very different for the Muslims on the one side and the Vatican on the other side.
Yeah, and so sort of carrying on from that, you've spoken a lot about the what the states are doing in this competition. How does this competition affect the the people, the Muslims who live in these countries day to day? How does it affect their faith and how they practice and how they see their faith and go about their lives?
Well, okay. Um, in Saudi Arabia, there's undeniably been very significant change that has changed people's daily lives, particularly women, but not only women. Whether that's with regard to entertainment and leisure, whether that's regard to less restrictive gender rules, whether that's with regard to opportunity. Uh, it's you can put ifs and buts on that, but the fact of the matter, it has changed. The issue here is that religious law hasn't kept up with it, and there's no attempt to 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 update religious law, if you wish. Certainly, no attempt in a country like Saudi Arabia.
Mm.
In fact, Mohammed bin Salman, in an interview a couple of years ago with The Atlantic, clearly said, "I'm the religious arbitrator. I decide." Um, the same is fundamentally true in the UAE. Now, the UAE doesn't have the religious cultural background of Saudi Arabia of recent decades, and therefore that degree of liberalization is easier. Its demography is also very different. It's 50, Emiratis are 15% of the population. Saudis are still a majority of the kingdom's population. Um, Indonesia again is very different because Indonesia it's a Muslim majority state, but it's a secular state.
Mm.
Even if Islam is the foremost, by 87% of the population, if I'm not incorrect, a massive majority, um, with all kinds of layerings. Um, but what one of the things I think that's important in all of this, what one of the fundamental factors that sets Indonesia apart from the Gulf states is it has an immensely strong civil society. When I talk about Nahdlatul Ulama, you're talking about a movement that has 90 million followers. That is 1/3 of the Indonesian population. It has 18,000 religious seminaries. It has a couple of hundred universities. It has a paramilitary force of 5 million, which is actually larger than the Indonesian military. It has ministers in cabinet, in government. So you're talking about real power here. The second largest movement, I mean, it's not the only civil society movement, there are numerous, but the second largest one is a movement of 30 to 40 million people. with similar attributes. So you have a very strong civil society, and in a sense, what these developments are coming from the bottom up rather than from the top down, as you're seeing in states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Mm. So that's quite interesting. And a question from the audience sort of follows on from that, that says, does Nada Ulama's non-state status offer the prospect of strengthening the roles of other similar groups around the world, also including Muslim diaspora communities? Are they setting an example that can be followed in other parts of the world?
In some ways, one would like that to be true. I think there's several issues here. First of all, there is no movement comparable to this, not in numbers and not in assets, if you wish, and not in clout. The history of reform in Islam has always been intellectuals, individuals, or small groups. It's never been large grassroots movements like you have here. I think that's one issue. The other issue is that, uh, in my mind, Nadatul Ulama is still trying to strike a balance. This is a movement that was founded 100 years ago. It was founded, you can, whatever way you want to describe this, some people describe it as having been founded in opposition to Wahhabism. Um, NU leaders, Nahdlatul Ulama leaders, talk about the need to fill a vacuum when the caliphate was abolished. So, in other words, this is a very Indonesian movement. Its stronghold is Java,
Hmm.
which has a very different history going back to Indonesian, culture and so on and so forth. And in certainly in Nahdlatul Ulama's concept of humanitarian Islam, there are elements of Javanese mythology and so on. And so there's this ambition on Nahdlatul Ulama's part, and they put a lot of effort into it, to be fair to them, to be an international player. But they haven't quite struck that balance between what it means to be an Indonesian player and what it means to be an international player.
Hmm.
Um, and then coming back to your question about the holy cities in Saudi Arabia, uh, you think of Islam, you think of Saudi, you think of the Middle East. You don't think of Pakistan, well, maybe Pakistan, or Bangladesh, or Indonesia, or India, which is basically the third or fourth largest in Muslim community.
And that ties in quite well with one last question, which is that, as well as competing with each other, these countries and entities have to sort of curry favor with the world powers, and India is one of those world powers, which has a huge Muslim minority, but is evidently, at the moment, an a Hindu nationalist government, and going in that direction. So how do the other Muslim countries sort of deal with that almost juxtaposition in India?
Well, okay, let me take the three rivals, if you wish, for moderate Islam. All three engaged with um, the Modi government at very senior levels. They engaged with the RSS, the Hindutva movement, the sort of the ideological cradle of Modi. Um, and in fact, so you had in 2022 the Bali summit, of the G20 with this religious component. The baton, if you wish, was for the next chairmanship was handed in Bali by the Indonesians to the Indians. There was an agreement that that the next R20 would be in India. And the basic, just to go back a bit of a background, there had been several years of engagement between Nahdlatul Ulama and the RSS on the principle, which is a principle on which Nahdlatul Ulama operates, which is there's no point in hitting people over the head. They're just going to walk away and not talk to you. You have to engage. Whether the engagement produces anything or not is a second question. But in any case, there was this agreement. That agreement fell apart for two reasons. One was because for a while, the center of lobbying, in a way, between the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Indonesians, was not Washington or London, it was Delhi. And the Saudis and the Emiratis certainly did not want a religious conference being held in India that they did not dominate. The second reason it fell apart was that Modi was afraid that a religious conference on the eve of the G20 would turn into an India bashing session. And he didn't want to do that. The final note on this question is both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in contrast to Nahdlatul Ulama, have publicly praised Modi in terms of the strife in India. They've shied away from criticizing. So has Nahdlatul Ulama, but it hasn't praised Modi either.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, so thank you very, very much for your time and for your lecture and for all the insights in the Q&A. For the audience, our next event is a reading room event on the 4th of June, in which Sophie Ibbotson will be talking to Vicky Davis about her new book, Central Asia in World War II, The Impact and Legacy of Fighting for the Soviet Union. And then following that, on the 11th of June, we have DPRK yesterday, today, and tomorrow with Glim Ford. So if anyone's interested in those events, all the details are on the website and you can book it there. But again, James, thank you very much for your time. It was a really interesting discussion.
Charles, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.